In the winter of 1981, Klaus Meine walked out of a doctor's office in Hanover, Germany, and stood on the sidewalk without moving for a long time. He was 33 years old. He had been singing since he was a teenager in the early days of Scorpions, back when they played tiny clubs for audiences who were not always listening. Back when the dream was so large and the reality was so small that keeping both of them in the same room required a particular kind of stubbornness. He had given his voice to every damp club in Germany, every drafty concert hall in England, every American city that had taken years to even notice that Scorpions existed. And now a doctor had just told him that the voice he had built all of that on might be gone. Not damaged, not tired, gone. The diagnosis was vocal cord polyps, growths that had developed slowly, silently, the way the worst problems always do. They had been building for a while, and Klaus had felt them the way a singer always feels something wrong before the doctors can name it. A roughness that would not quite clear, a note that kept sliding away when it should have been solid, a fatigue at the end of a show that went deeper than the physical. He had ignored it the way working musicians ignore things, because the tour does not stop for discomfort, and the stage does not care how you feel before you walk on. Now there was no more ignoring it. Surgery was the only option. But the surgeon had been careful with his words, the way surgeons are when they cannot promise anything. Recovery was possible. A full recovery was not certain. A return to the kind of singing Scorpions required, the power, the range, the sustained physical demand of rock and roll at that level, was something no doctor in the world was willing to guarantee. Klaus did not call Rudolf Schenker that afternoon. He needed a few hours with the information before he could give it to someone else. But news like that travels fast inside a band, especially one that had spent the better part of 15 years in the same rooms, on the same tour buses, sharing the same silences and the same cheap meals and the same impossible hope. Rudolf found out before the end of the day. Herman Rarebell found out. Francis Buchholz found out. And Matthias Jobs, who had only been in the band for 2 years, who was still learning what it meant to belong to something this old and this fragile, found out in a phone call that lasted less than 5 minutes. There was very little talking after that, because what was there to say? Scorpions in 1981 were not yet the band they were about to become. They were well respected in Germany and across parts of Europe. Japan had been extraordinary for them. Japanese audiences had embraced them years before anyone else would, and there was something both flattering and quietly painful about being a band whose biggest love had come from the other side of the world. But America, the place that mattered most in rock and roll in 1981, was still a territory they had not fully claimed. They had toured it, they had played it, they had fought for radio attention that mostly did not come. They were a German band trying to be heard by an audience that had more than enough of its own rock acts to choose from, and the label was beginning to ask the kind of questions that labels ask when patience starts to cost money. The timing of Klaus's voice crisis was, by any measure, the worst possible. The band had been building toward a new album. The pressure to deliver something that would break them in America was enormous. Not always stated directly, but present in every conversation, in every careful word from the people around them who had financial interests in the outcome. The music business is patient when it is making money, and ruthless when it is not. In 1981, Scorpions were in the long and difficult middle space between those two conditions. And now the voice was gone. Not the band, not the songs, not Rudolf's belief or Matthias's guitar or the rhythm section that had held everything together through a decade of grinding tours. All of that was still there, intact, waiting. But the voice, the thing that made scorpions sound like scorpions, the voice that had carried their music across 15 years and a dozen countries, that voice was in a hospital room, waiting to find out what it would be on the other side of surgery. This was not just a voice problem. This was the sound of a dream beginning to crack. And somewhere in Hanover, in a room that felt too quiet for a Tuesday afternoon, Klaus Meine sat alone and tried to imagine what came next. The surgery happened in the fall of 1981, and for a while it seemed like it had not worked. The recovery was slow, in the way that recoveries from vocal surgery always are, measured not in weeks, but in the agonizing distance between silence and sound, between a whisper and a note, between a note and something that could honestly be called singing. Klaus had been told to rest his voice completely. No talking above a whisper, no singing at all. He sat in the quiet of a winter that felt longer than any winter he could remember, and he waited. Rudolf Schenker was not a man who waited easily. He was the engine of Scorpions. He always had been, going back to the very beginning when the band was just a dream shared between young men in post-war Hanover who believed in rock and roll with the kind of faith that does not require evidence. Rudolf had held this band together through lineup changes, through years of near misses, through the slow grind of building an audience one city at a time in countries that were not always interested in what a German rock band had to offer. He had never allowed himself the luxury of giving up. But he was also a practical man. And the practical question that everyone around Scorpions was asking, quietly, carefully, but asking nonetheless, was this: should they find another singer? Not permanently, just temporarily, to finish the album, to keep the momentum alive, to give the labels something to hold on to while Klaus recovered. If he recovered. There were names mentioned. There were conversations had in rooms that Rudolf was not always in. The machine around a band like Scorpions does not stop turning just because one of its most important parts has broken. The machine asks what can be replaced. Rudolf's answer was no. Not a negotiated no, not a "we'll think about it" no. A quiet, firm, final no that he delivered once and did not feel the need to repeat. Klaus was the voice of Scorpions, not a voice, the voice. And if that voice needed time, then Scorpions would take the time. They would wait. They would find another way through. It was a decision that could have destroyed them. Everyone around the band knew it. The album was already delayed. The label's patience had a measurable bottom. The American radio window that Scorpions had been working toward for years was not going to stay open indefinitely. In the rock and roll landscape of 1981, bands rose and disappeared in the space of a single season, and no one waited for anyone. But the band waited. And in the waiting, something happened that no one had planned for. The music that was taking shape during those months, the songs that would eventually become Blackout, began to carry the weight of everything the band was living through. The uncertainty, the fear, the particular stubbornness of having come so far and being asked to stop. Songs do not announce what went into making them. They almost never do. But the feelings were there, invisible and present, the way the most important things always are. When Klaus finally came back to the microphone, cautiously, carefully, testing each note the way a man tests ice before he walks across it, what came out was not quite the same voice that had gone in. The surgery had changed something. The months of silence had changed something more. And the experience of sitting alone with the question of whether all of it, the dream, the band, the music, would simply end in a hospital corridor in 1981 had changed something deeper than either of those. The voice that sang Blackout was a voice that had been somewhere dark and come back from it. You can hear it on the record if you listen closely. There is a weight in that singing that was not quite there before, a texture that is not damage, it is depth. The kind of depth that only arrives after a person has stood very close to the edge of losing something and chosen, against every reasonable instinct, to believe it was still possible. The voice was not just Klaus's instrument. It was the bridge they had all been walking across. And Rudolf Schenker had refused to let anyone burn it down. Blackout was released in May of 1982, and the world, for once, was paying attention. Not all at once. Nothing in Scorpions' history had ever come all at once. But the album moved differently than anything they had released before. It reached radio stations that had not previously been interested. It found American audiences who had been vaguely aware of Scorpions for years without quite being given a reason to stop and listen. Blackout gave them that reason. No One Like You became the kind of rock song that a generation latches onto and does not let go. The kind that finds you in a car on a summer night and becomes permanently attached to the memory of that night and every night like it. The whole album had an urgency to it that reviewers noticed even when they could not fully explain where it came from. Most people who heard Blackout in 1982 did not know what had gone into making it. They did not know about the surgery, the silence, the winter of waiting, or the quiet decision Rudolf had made to hold the band together by refusing to consider the alternative. That private history was not on the album cover. It was just in the music, invisible but present, the way the most important parts of anything always are. Scorpions toured Blackout without slowing down. They played cities they had played before to crowds that were noticeably larger. And the difference was not simply a number, it was the quality of the attention. The audiences knew the songs. They had heard them on the radio. They had bought the record. They were not discovering Scorpions anymore. They were welcoming them to something they had already decided they wanted. Through all of it, Klaus Meine sang. Every night, city after city, the voice that a doctor had once been careful not to promise would return, carrying every song to its finish. Those who were around him during that tour say there was something different about the way he stood at the microphone in the Blackout era. A stillness, a groundedness, the bearing of a man who has come close to losing something and carries that knowledge not as a wound, but as a kind of quiet, private pride. A band is not tested when the crowd is screaming. A band is tested when the room goes quiet. Scorpions had sat in that quiet room in the winter of 1981, and they had refused to leave without each other. That refusal, that act of loyalty that no business case could justify, that no one outside the band had asked for, was the thing that made Blackout what it was. Not the production, not the timing. Loyalty. Nothing more complicated than that. 40 years later, No One Like You still plays on classic rock stations across America. And every time it does, somewhere inside those 3.5 minutes, there is the echo of a decision made quietly, in a room most people will never hear about. The decision to wait. The decision to believe. The decision that one voice, one specific, irreplaceable voice, was worth whatever it cost to protect. That is what great bands are made of. Not the songs alone, not the tours or the stage lights or the leather and the arenas. What makes a great band great is the thing they refuse to do when everyone around them says it would be easier. Scorpions refused to let the voice go. And because of that refusal, the voice came back and gave the world something it has never stopped listening to. If stories like this remind you why this music still matters, subscribe, because there are more chapters from the history of rock that have never been told.